Thank you very much, Olive. And I'm speaking to Judge Kithi, who's an advocate of the High Court, and is just going to give us his thoughts from the legal perspective of the different aspects of the Constitution. And thank you for joining us. And maybe we could just begin by, there's a number of things that have come up when it comes to the Constitution and the legality about many things. And maybe just briefly, what is your scorecard, your analysis of the 10 years of the Constitution? How do you feel we are faring?
Thank you. The Constitution is a document that attempts to regulate behavior and relationship among Kenyans. It is a document that, although we sing about it so much, there's something that we miss out. It must be implemented by human beings. And the people themselves, therefore, should be responsible for what the desires of that Constitution are. So that a Constitution on its own won't guarantee you and me what we desire. To be honest, it is what then ought to be regulated, and ingraining that which ought to be regulated in ourselves, so that then the Constitution becomes neither here nor there. It is just because we are behaved and automized in a certain way in the manner in which we relate for the greater good that is important. So in as much as we clamor for the Constitution and keep on talking about it, there is one thing we must not miss. It is you and me, and how the public then socializes itself and attempts to relate to each other. That which is regulated, if it becomes so common to be such that regulating it is difficult, then there's no meaning of a Constitution. And by the way, some of the countries that have gone into turmoil and have very bad histories have had constitutions too, in fact, very good constitutions. And some of them, we even borrowed from them. And by the way, not like the American history is the best history. It has its own bad side in terms of how it's treated its citizens, and yet we borrow from it. So you realize that notwithstanding that a document can speak the good, but the deeds can be bad. And suffice it to say that the Constitution, in terms of giving a scorecard, will be this, that how has it, or how have we behaved in terms of allowing ourselves to be regulated by the good in the Constitution. And I think the proper sense would be, yes, it has cultured ourselves into believing that we're in a regime of change that has changed, and we are departing, or we departed from a past regime that was oppressive, and so many things that we didn't like. Now, as to whether or not we have properly behaved, I think there's a gradual advancement, albeit very slow, but there's a gradual advancement into accommodating the spirit of that Constitution by enforcement. So it's more about how we enforce the compliance, the constitutional provision, than whether ourselves are good enough to complement the Constitution. The Constitution, therefore, seems far more ahead of us than the way we are socialized.
So do you feel it's time to change the Constitution?
No. I think it is time to investigate whether the Constitution aspires into everything that we do. But let me tell you this. We can change the Constitution into an ideal. In fact, we can have it dropped like the way the tabernacle was dropped by God to the Israelites. But the Israelites continued to defy God, notwithstanding that the document was not made by them. It must have been so perfect because it came from God. Yet the defiance continued. So much so that if we are going to have a constitution made by ourselves, of course from a human imperfection, it is going to be human-made. But even a document made by God is defied by man. I don't think that a document made by man is not going to be defied by man. So it is more about how then we continue to find a solution into ourselves, how we change ourselves more than changing the Constitution. Now, it is many times that you could cancel a letter to a person, but how the person receives that letter in terms of the message you're giving, notwithstanding how much you cancel it to send it to that person, I mean, it's how it communicates, but how also it is the person is responsive to the communication you give. And more often at times, the interpretation is very different, and elements of the environment in which that is received also is different. For instance, how is the historical aspect as to embracing the environment of the document?
So it's basically a culture change more than just a document
Exactly,
change.
And that's my point. Now, there are countries, by the way, that don't even have a written constitution. So then they don't even change that constitution. But the constitution is unwritten, and has certain aspects of practice in terms of their customs, such that it is those customs that are ingrained in their personalities, and therefore they relate to each other because then there's a culture to it. Okay. Because of that, then they have more moral standing in their decision making and in terms of how they relate than those written documents that we aspire. Yes, it is good to have a good document, certainly, and it's good to improve it, but it is more about how we ourselves change ourselves as opposed to a document that is written.
Okay, so we've got our ongoing series of We the People, and we've interviewed a number of people who are involved in the constitution making or have been in leadership or are voices of repute when it comes to the law. And something that keeps coming up is that the executive arm of government has been disregarding court orders and the likes, and has been we've been seeing the individuals flouting rules openly, including the president, but with almost like what has been said with an utadu kind of attitude. Now, the executive has been accused of breeding anarchy. And then we've also seen it becoming more when we see how the separation of powers between the National Assembly, especially, or the Parliament at large, and the executive is not very clear. What's your comment on this? And what, as we close, what does this portend for Kenya?
I think that's an interesting debate. Yes, there has been complaints, and we have complained as lawyers many times that the executive has not been doing its part in terms of obeying the law and obeying court orders. Now, that aside, I'll ask the question, why is there evil in society when God exists? Why then is it that there's death, there's suffering in society, yet there's God? It is because the arc of goodness will eventually come. So there'll continue to be a struggle in society for those that are in power against those that are ruled, until a time when those that rule are good people who then complement the desires of that they rule. What I mean is this, that even when there's friction between the executive and judiciary, and this is what I want to say, the executive of the three arms holds the ultimate power because they hold or they control the tools of violence. The moment you have the police and the army and the intelligence and everything, then you're more powerful than the one that has controlled that. Okay. But then you must be regulated. When you are regulated, unfortunately, an enforcement of the instruction that regulates you, that must be through the police, which you control. It means, therefore, you have an element of discretion, albeit illegally, to apply in terms of what then you can obey or not through a command system. Now, if the person who then controls the police disobeys court orders, it's unfortunate. But the point is, power is only to a term. Okay. When you leave, then you can be held account. That's why I said from inception that the good will always override the bad. So what the comfort we have is that, notwithstanding that today a person is office and because of that moment refuses to obey court orders, that command of court doesn't go. Okay. Eventually they'll be held accountable.
Okay, thank you very much. We've been speaking with Judge Kithi, who's an advocate of the High Court, who's given us some insight in regards to the Constitution. And one of the main things that you pick up here is that it is more of a change of culture among the people, right from the leadership to, the common wananchi, as we call them, more than a change of document, even as we go into the space where there's a lot of clamor for change of constitution, which is being spearheaded by the president himself. Thank you very much for speaking to us, George. I hand you back to Olive Barrows, who's at the Bomas of Kenya, where we shall be having some good stuff as well as some warthogs. Olive.